In the middle of a strategy meeting in front of the entire leadership team and hundreds of employees, Celeste Blackthorne announced that her nephew, fresh out of school, would now approve every decision made by the man who had spent 9 years turning the company's weakest division into its most profitable. Owen Parker did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He set his badge on the table and walked out of the building. 6 months later, the woman who had humiliated him stood outside his office asking for help. What happened in between? The Northstar floor of Blackthorne Dynamics never fully emptied. There was always a light on in the corner conference room, always a phone ringing at an hour no reasonable client should be calling. Owen Parker had built it that way on purpose, and he had also built the thing that made it bearable, which was a rule that nobody worked a crisis alone. When the Halverson account nearly collapsed in the second year, he had slept in the office 4 nights running, and so had 6 other people, and the client had never learned how close it came. 9 years earlier, Northstar had been the division the company discussed only behind closed doors. It lost money in a way that felt structural rather than accidental, and the board had talked about selling it. Owen was 31 then, a project lead with a reputation for saying uncomfortable things in a calm voice, and when he asked for the division, 2 of the executives laughed. Celeste Blackthorne did not laugh. She handed it to him the way a person hands over something she expects to be rid of soon. He did not turn it around with a slogan. He read every contract the division had signed in 6 years and found that Northstar priced work by hope instead of by capacity. He rebuilt the intake process around a review gate that no proposal could clear without a signed capacity assessment from the people who would actually do the work. He removed 2 managers who had lied about delivery timelines, and he promoted a scheduler named Maren Whitaker, who had been quietly correcting their numbers for years without credit. By the 9th year, Northstar generated nearly 40% of the corporation's profit and held 3 of its 4 largest accounts, including Hearn Industrial, whose contracts alone produced more revenue than 2 other divisions combined. Douglas Hearn had been a difficult client for everyone who came before Owen. He had been Owen's client for 7 years without a single escalation. None of this had ever carried Owen's name outside the building. When the trade press ran a feature on the turnaround, the cover photograph was Celeste, arms folded, standing in the lobby, and the article used the phrase "her vision" 4 times. Someone in marketing had the cover enlarged and framed, and it went up on the lobby wall beside the elevators where it stayed. Owen read the piece on his phone in the parking garage, closed the browser, and went upstairs to a capacity meeting. Maren brought it up once, and he told her the work was the point, and the credit was weather. She was not satisfied with that, but she let it go. He was a single father, and he had arranged his life around that fact without ever discussing it at work. He took the earliest meetings and refused the late ones. He had turned down a regional vice presidency in the 6th year because it required relocation, and Celeste had told him with what he assumed was sincerity that she respected him more for it. What that arrangement had taught him over 9 years was how to carry a full weight without narrating it to anybody. Nobody in the building had ever heard him complain. The first sign that something was changing came in a budget meeting in March, when Celeste mentioned that her nephew had finished his degree and was interested in operations. She said it the way a person mentions the weather. Owen said that was good news and moved to the 3rd quarter forecast, and he thought about it for perhaps 4 minutes afterward. Tristan Blackthorne arrived in April with a title nobody could quite define: Strategic Initiatives. He was 24, articulate and completely comfortable in rooms where he had no reason to be comfortable. He had never managed a team, never carried a delivery deadline, never sat across from a client losing money because of something his organization had done. He had read a great deal, and he spoke in the confident vocabulary of a man who had absorbed the conclusions of an industry without any of the injuries that produced them. In his first week, he asked Owen for a walkthrough of the intake process, and Owen gave him 2 hours and a full explanation of every gate. Tristan listened, nodded frequently, and said at the end that the process was impressive, but appeared designed for a company afraid of losing rather than one intending to win. Owen told him the process existed because the division had once lost $11 million in a single year. Tristan said that was 9 years ago, and the market had changed. By June, he had stopped asking. He sat in on client calls without notifying the account leads. He told a delivery manager that the capacity assessment was a bottleneck and should be treated as advisory rather than binding. When Marin escalated it, Owen went to Celeste's office and explained in the flat, unhurried way he explained everything, that the gate was not bureaucracy, but the mechanism keeping the division from promising work it could not perform. Celeste listened with her hands folded. She said Tristan was learning that a fresh perspective was healthy and that Owen should not feel threatened by a young man's enthusiasm. The word threatened sat in the room a moment longer than the rest of the sentence. Owen said he was not threatened, he was accountable, and those were different conditions. Celeste smiled and said she would speak to Tristan. Walking back down the hallway, Owen understood that she would not. Tristan's growth plan arrived in July as a 40-slide deck. It proposed raising contracted volume by 60% within 12 months, entering 2 adjacent service categories the division had no staff for, and cutting what the deck called process overhead by half. There was no hiring plan and no capacity model attached. When Owen asked which of the largest accounts had been consulted, Tristan said client consultation was a backward-looking method and that markets were made, not surveyed. Owen wrote a 5-page response. He did not argue with the ambition. He laid out line by line what each element would require in headcount, in specialist certification, in lead time. He showed that the 2 adjacent categories carried a 19-month ramp for a firm starting from zero, and that removing the review gate would restore precisely the conditions that had produced the $11 million year. He sent it to Celeste and Tristan together and copied nobody else, because he had never been a man who fought through distribution lists. Celeste replied in one line thanking him for his thoroughness. Tristan did not reply at all. 2 weeks later in a leadership session, Tristan presented the same deck without a single change and described the review gate as a legacy artifact. Owen watched from the far end of the table while Marin beside him wrote something on a pad and turned it so he could see. It said, "He knows you sent that." Owen drew a line through it and slid it back. Something had shifted in the building by August, and Owen registered it the way a person registers a change in air pressure. People began prefacing bad news with apologies. A project lead flagged a slipping milestone privately and asked him to keep it out of the weekly report. And when Owen asked why the man said Tristan had made a comment in a stand-up about people who look for reasons things cannot be done, it was a small sentence. It had already begun rewriting how 200 people spoke to each other. Marin came to his office at the end of that month and closed the door, which she almost never did. She had been with him 8 years. She said 3 of her schedulers had stopped submitting honest capacity numbers because honest numbers were being treated as insubordination, and that if the gate became advisory, she would not be able to protect the delivery calendar. Owen asked what she wanted him to do, and she said she wanted him to fight out loud in a room with the board in it. He told her he had a better instrument than volume, which was evidence, and that the numbers would make the argument for him. She said evidence only worked on people who wanted to be correct. He had no answer for that, and the absence of one stayed with him longer than the conversation did. In early September, Douglas Hearn called him directly. Hearn had received a proposal from Blackthorn Dynamics for an expanded scope of work delivered by a young man he had never met, promising a schedule his own engineers had called impossible. He wanted to know whether Owen had signed off on it, and Owen said he had not seen it. There was a long stretch on the line before Hearn said he had done business with Owen for 7 years on the strength of one thing, which was that Owen had never once told him something that turned out not to be true. He asked Owen to keep it that way, and Owen said he would. He went to Celeste that afternoon and told her unapproved proposals were going out to the largest account in the corporation. She said Tristan had been given latitude to develop opportunities. Owen asked whether latitude included commitments the division could not deliver, and she said he was being dramatic. He said he was being specific and that there was a difference, and that if Hearn Industrial walked, the corporation would lose more than its two smallest divisions produced together. Celeste told him the company-wide meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and that a number of organizational questions would be settled then. It was meant to close the conversation, and it did. Owen spent the following week doing what he always did, which was work. He closed 2 delivery milestones, resolved a staffing conflict, and reviewed a forecast that was strong. He assumed in a way he would later find almost embarrassing that strong numbers were a form of protection. He had never sought the title above his own. He had never asked to be photographed in the lobby. He had spent 9 years believing that if he made the thing work, the arrangement around it would hold. The all-hands was held in the atrium because no conference room in the building held that many people. Owen arrived 3 minutes early and stood along the side wall out of habit because he had always given the chairs to people who spent their day at desks. Marin found him and stood beside him without saying anything. Gerald Ashford, who chaired the board and rarely attended internal meetings, was seated in the second row, which Owen noticed and did not know how to interpret. Celeste opened with the quarter's results and spoke for 11 minutes about momentum and about a company that had learned to reinvent itself. She used the word legacy twice, both times, in a sentence where it meant something to be overcome. Then she said that great organizations were defined by their willingness to evolve their leadership structures, and Owen felt the room's attention move toward him before a single word about him had been said. She announced that Owen Parker would continue to lead the Northstar division, and she stopped there long enough for a scattering of applause to begin and die out unnaturally, because everyone could hear that the sentence had not ended. She said that going forward, all Northstar decisions, pricing, staffing, delivery commitments, client proposals would route through Tristan Blackthorne for approval. She said this would combine deep operational experience with fresh strategic vision, and that she was excited for what the partnership would produce. Tristan stood at the front with his hands behind his back, looking out over 200 people who all knew exactly what had happened. Somebody in the middle rows coughed. Marin turned her head to look at Owen, and he could feel her doing it, and did not look back, because he was performing the arithmetic his entire career had trained him to perform quickly and without emotion. He would still sign the delivery guarantees. He would still be the name on the client contracts, still the man Douglas Hearn called at 7 in the morning, still accountable for every number the division produced. And he would have no authority over a single decision that produced them. He had spent 9 years teaching 200 people that whoever owns the outcome has to own the choice. He had built the entire culture of that floor on one idea, and the woman at the lectern had just dismantled it in front of all of them and called it a partnership. Celeste asked whether he had anything to add. It was meant as a courtesy, and it was meant to be declined. Owen walked to the front of the atrium and stood beside the lectern rather than behind it, facing the room, and he spoke for less than 30 seconds. He said the division had been rebuilt on one principle, which was that whoever answers for the result gets to make the decision. He said that was not a preference and not a process. It was the reason Northstar had stopped losing money 9 years ago. He said that under the structure just announced he would be responsible for outcomes he was not permitted to control, and that he would not sign his name to that, because his name was the only thing he had ever actually built there. He took his badge from his jacket pocket and set it on the corner of the lectern, close enough to Celeste that she could have reached it without moving her feet. He said he was resigning effective immediately. He thanked the people in the folding chairs and told them the work had always been theirs. Then he walked the length of the atrium toward the doors and the only sound in that room was his footsteps on the polished floor, and behind him, near the front, the small metallic noise of a badge sliding an inch across the lectern where nobody had yet picked it up. The badge stayed on the lectern for the rest of the day. Somebody eventually put it in a manila envelope in the Human Resources office with Owen's employee number on the front where it remained for months. That detail would matter later, in a room where nobody expected it to. Tristan took over Northstar on the following Monday. His first act was a message to the entire division describing the change as an opportunity to move faster. His second 6 days later was to convert the intake gate from a requirement into a recommendation, and he did not announce that one. It appeared as a revision to an internal procedure document, and the only person who noticed within the first week was Maren Whitaker, who read it twice and sat looking at her screen for a long time before doing anything at all. She raised it in the operations meeting. She explained without heat that the gate was the only mechanism connecting what the company sold to what the company could build, and that removing it did not make the division faster, it made the division blind. Tristan thanked her for the historical context. He said the division had been managed for 9 years by someone who optimized for avoiding failure rather than achieving growth, and that the results had been adequate, but the ceiling had been low. Nobody in the room said the words 40% out loud, though every person there knew the number. What changed after that was almost impossible to point at. A delivery lead flagged a resourcing conflict and was told to solve it rather than report it. A pricing analyst noted that a proposed margin assumed a staffing level the division did not have, and the note was removed before the document went out. Within 3 weeks, the weekly risk report, a single page Owen had required for 9 years listing every project slipping by more than 4 days, stopped being produced, because the person who produced it had learned that appearing on it was worse than being on it. Maren kept her own version and distributed it to nobody. She could not have explained at the time why she bothered. Owen was working out of a rented room above a bank branch with a single desk, a folding table, and internet that failed twice a day. He had registered Parker Ridge Advisory 9 days after walking out of the atrium. He had savings, and he had decided early that the firm would carry no debt and take no outside partners, which meant it could only grow at the speed at which it earned. He did no marketing. He built a document instead, a 40-page operating framework describing exactly how a delivery organization should connect commercial promises to production capacity, and he sent it to nobody. His first client came through a man he had worked with 6 years earlier at a logistics firm who called because a program was failing, and he remembered how Owen had handled a similar failure. Owen spent 2 weeks inside that company, found they were signing contracts against a capacity model 3 years out of date, and rebuilt it. The engagement was worth less than a month of what Blackthorn Dynamics had paid him. He treated it as though it were worth 10 times that, because it was the only thing he had. The second client came from the first, and the third from the second. By the 11th week, he had 4 active engagements and had taken over the empty suite next door, because there was no longer room for both the folding table and the volume of paper. He worked the way he had worked in the second year of Northstar constantly and without complaint, and he found that he did not miss the building across town at all. What surprised him was how little anger there was. He had expected to carry it. Instead, there was a clean quiet, the sensation of a weight he had not known he was holding being set down. The first serious crack at Northstar appeared in November. A manufacturing client called Ridgeline had been sold an expanded scope in October, under terms assuming a specialist certification the division did not hold. Nobody had checked, because the check had been the gate. The problem surfaced 8 days before delivery, and Tristan's response was to reassign 4 people from another project, which met the immediate deadline and created a second failure downstream on a smaller account that then canceled. He described that cancellation in his monthly report as a strategic deprioritization. Gerald Ashford, reading it in the board packet, made a note in the margin and did not raise it because one small account leaving was not by itself a signal. The signal came in December from Douglas Hearn. Hearn Industrial had renewed every year for 7 years, and the renewal window opened in the first week of December. Tristan sent a proposal that raised contracted volume by roughly half-shortened the delivery cycle by 3 weeks, and included a presentation about partnership velocity. Hearn forwarded it to his own engineering director and received back a 2-line assessment stating that the schedule was not achievable by any organization and that the pricing suggested the vendor did not understand its own cost structure. Hearn did not renew, and he did not negotiate either. He wrote a short letter making no accusations, thanked the company for 7 years, and declined to continue. Then he called Owen Parker at 7 in the morning the way he always had. He said he had spent 7 years able to make plans on the strength of one man's word, and that the word was gone from the building, and he asked whether Owen was taking clients. Owen said he was taking work he could actually do, and that Hearn Industrial was larger than anything he currently had capacity for. Hearn said he was aware of that and would rather wait for a real answer than receive a fast one. He gave Owen one work stream to start with rather than the whole account, and said the rest would follow if the first one held. That single decision did 2 things at once. It gave Parker Ridge Advisory its first engagement large enough to require hiring, and it removed from Blackthorn Dynamics the largest revenue line on its books. The fourth quarter closed in late January, and Northstar posted a loss, the first losing quarter the division had recorded in 9 years. Tristan attributed it to transitional friction and legacy client concentration, a phrase that meant the company's biggest customer leaving was actually a form of diversification. Celeste circulated the report with a note calling the quarter a necessary correction. Ashford read both documents on a Sunday evening and then went back through 18 months of Northstar reporting in a single sitting. 2 floors below, Marin had begun receiving calls from other companies because word travels in a narrow industry, and she had turned down 2 of them. She was not sentimental about the building. She stayed because there were 60 people on the delivery floor who had no idea how bad the calendar had become, and she had not yet decided whether leaving would be an escape or an abandonment. By the end of January, the direction of the whole situation had inverted, and both sides could feel it without either side saying it. Owen had 4 employees and a waiting list. 3 of the companies that came to him arrived unprompted, and 2 of them had considered Blackthorn Dynamics and chosen not to proceed. He never mentioned his former employer in a meeting. He did not have to. The market had noticed that the operating model everyone admired had walked out of that building and had noticed where it went. The question that had defined the last week of September, whether Owen could survive without Blackthorn Dynamics, had quietly stopped being a question. The question underneath it was whether Blackthorn Dynamics could survive without Owen. Nobody at the company had permitted themselves to ask it out loud, and that inability was itself the reason things kept getting worse. Tristan's response to the loss was to sell more. He treated the shortfall as a volume problem, which made the solution contracts, and there was nobody left inside the division with both the standing and the willingness to tell him what a contract cost to deliver. In February, he closed 3 agreements in 9 days. One of them, the largest single commitment Northstar had ever signed, a full platform program for a company called Wexler Grove with a delivery date in mid-March and a penalty clause Tristan described in his announcement as a demonstration of confidence. Marin read the penalty clause and went to his office without an appointment. She told him the program required a team of 18 with 2 specialist certifications, that Northstar had 11 people available and 1 certification, and that the mid-March date was not aggressive, but arithmetically impossible. She said she would put it in writing. Tristan told her to put it in writing, and added that she had been shaped by a manager who confused caution with rigor, and that the organization would eventually have to decide whether it worked for its customers or for its process. She sent the memo that afternoon and copied Celeste. Celeste did not respond. Through February, the program consumed everything. People were pulled from 3 other accounts to feed it. 2 of those accounts slipped, and one client of 5 years sent a formal notice of dissatisfaction. Over time became permanent. 4 senior delivery leads resigned in the same 3-week stretch, including 2 who had been with Owen since the 3rd year, and each was described in Tristan's staffing update as a natural transition, consistent with organizational renewal. The Wexler Grove demonstration was scheduled for the 11th of March in the client's own boardroom with their executive team present. Tristan chose to run it personally. The platform failed inside the first 6 minutes, not gracefully and not partially, but completely in front of 11 people who had signed a contract based on a promise about exactly this moment. Tristan tried to continue with slides. The client's chief operating officer asked him to stop, and then asked a question Tristan could not answer, which was who inside Blackthorn Dynamics had certified that the timeline was achievable. Wexler Grove terminated within 72 hours and invoked the penalty clause. 2 other clients, hearing about it through the ordinary channels by which such things travel, terminated within the following 2 weeks. By the 25th of March, Northstar had lost Hearn Industrial Wexler Grove and 3 other accounts, and the finance office produced a cash position showing somewhere between 5 and 7 weeks of operating runway. Ashford called an emergency session of the board on the 28th. He opened by putting 18 months of Northstar reporting on the table and stating that the board had been given a description of the division that did not match the division. He announced a formal review of all Northstar commercial decisions dating back to the previous September, conducted by outside counsel, and he said the words outside counsel while looking at Celeste. She did not object, because objecting would have been an answer, and she did not yet know what the question was going to be. That was the week Celeste Blackthorn drove across town to Parker Ridge Advisory. It was the 1st of April, 6 months, and changed since the all-hands. She did not call ahead. Owen's assistant told him a woman in reception said she had no appointment, but that he would see her anyway, and Owen said to bring her back. The office was not impressive. It was clean and small and full of working people, 11 of them now, 3 of them former Northstar. Celeste walked past all of them, and she saw every one, and by the time she sat down across from Owen, she had understood something about the arithmetic of the last 6 months that no report had managed to convey. She did not begin with an apology. She began by saying the situation at Northstar had deteriorated, and that a great many people who had worked for him for years would lose their jobs in roughly 6 weeks. She said Hearn Industrial would come back if Owen asked that Wexler Grove could be renegotiated, that the board would restore his title, and that she was prepared to make the compensation whatever number he wanted to write down. Owen listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he asked her one question, which was, who would approve the pricing? Celeste said Tristan would be given a different role. Owen asked whether Tristan would still report to her, and she said, of course. He asked whether the review gate would be restored as a binding requirement, with authority residing inside the division rather than in the executive office, and she said governance details could be worked out. He told her that governance details were not a detail, they were the entire thing, and that she had just spent 6 months proving it at a cost of 3 of the corporation's 4 largest accounts. He said he was not walking back into a structure designed to make one person responsible and a different person unaccountable. He said the structure had not changed, only the results had, and that a man who returns to fix a system while leaving its power arrangement intact is not a leader, only a shield. If the answer was to make him responsible again, while the same office kept approval authority, then the answer was no, and it would still be no in 6 weeks. Celeste sat in that small office and understood she had nothing left to offer him. She had come with money and a title, the only 2 instruments she had ever needed, and neither had moved him an inch. What she said next was quiet, And it was the closest thing to honesty she had produced in 9 years, that she had not understood what he was actually doing, and that she had assumed it would keep working after he left, because it had always looked so effortless. Owen's assistant knocked twice. Gerald Ashford was in reception with 2 board members and a lawyer from the outside firm scheduled with Parker Ridge Advisory for 3 o'clock. Ashford came in and did not appear surprised to find Celeste there, which told her how long the board had been working without her. He informed her formally and in front of Owen that the review had already established a documented pattern of capacity objections raised inside the division and overridden from the executive office, and that the board no longer accepted the account of events it had been given. Then he told her the rest. The board had concluded that Northstar could not be recovered under current ownership within the available runway, and had directed him to open negotiations for the sale of the entire division to an investor group. That group had approached the board 2 weeks earlier. Its lead was seated on the other side of the desk. Celeste turned to look at Owen, and he met her eyes without triumph and without apology, and she understood that she had lost control of the company in the moment she decided 6 months earlier that the man who built it should have to ask her nephew for permission. The board met 4 times in the 11 days that followed, and none of those meetings produced a decision because the decision was not actually about money. The arithmetic had been settled in the first session. Northstar had 5 weeks of runway, a terminated flagship program, with a penalty obligation attached, 5 departed accounts, and a delivery organization that had lost 7 of its most experienced people since October. Recapitalizing it from the parent balance sheet was possible. It was also, according to the outside firm's assessment, a way of spending $18 million to buy 4 more months of the same outcome, because the thing that had broken was not the cash position. What the board could not decide was whether it was willing to admit that in writing. Selling Northstar meant releasing 40% of the corporation's historical profit engine and stating publicly why. It meant conceding that a division solvent and dominant for 9 consecutive years had been destroyed in 6 months by a governance choice made in an atrium in front of 200 people. Ashford said in the second session that the board's discomfort was not a reason to keep the division, and that the alternative to discomfort now was insolvency in 5 weeks, which would be considerably less comfortable and considerably more public. Celeste's response was to construct a different story. She had spent 9 years being the woman in the lobby photograph, and she understood that the version of events which survives is usually the one told first and most confidently. So she told the board that Owen Parker had planned this, that he had resigned theatrically in front of the entire company in order to destabilize the division, that he had spent 6 months courting Blackthorn Dynamics clients with inside knowledge of their contract terms, that 3 former Northstar employees at Parker Ridge Advisory constituted a coordinated extraction, and that the investor group now circling the division was the final step of something he had been building since the day he walked out. It was a coherent story. It accounted for every fact. The only difficulty was that the review had collected the documents. The outside firm presented on the 9th of April, and the presentation ran 80 minutes and was almost entirely paper. It began with the 5-page memo Owen had sent in July addressed to Celeste and Tristan, and copied to nobody, laying out line by line why the growth plan required headcount the division did not have, and a ramp the plan did not allow. It included 11 documented capacity objections raised between October and February, 9 of them from Marin Whitaker, each overridden in writing from the executive office, each override carrying a timestamp. It included Marin's February memo stating that the Wexler Grove delivery date was arithmetically impossible, sent to Tristan and copied to Celeste, to which no reply had ever been made. And it included the procedure revision converting the intake gate from binding to advisory, dated 6 days after Owen's resignation, with Tristan's credentials attached to the change. Then the firm addressed the accusation directly because Ashford had instructed them to. Owen Parker's employment agreement contained no non-compete provision, a fact confirmed by the corporation's own counsel, because Celeste had personally removed it in the 6th year when Owen turned down the regional vice presidency, and she wanted to signal that she trusted him. He had taken no documents when he left. His badge had been surrendered in front of 200 witnesses and had sat in an envelope in the Human Resources office ever since, which meant his system access had terminated the same afternoon, which the logs confirmed. Douglas Hearn had provided a written statement voluntarily. It said that Hearn Industrial declined to renew in December on the basis of a proposal his own engineers assessed as undeliverable, that the decision was made before he had any contact with Owen Parker, and that he had contacted Owen afterward rather than the reverse. It contained one further sentence, which the firm read aloud, that in 7 years, Owen Parker had never once given him information that turned out not to be true, and that this had been the entire basis of the relationship. The 3 former Northstar employees had resigned individually at intervals of several weeks, and 2 had first approached other firms. Nothing in 6 months of correspondence showed Owen soliciting a single client of his former employer. The investor group had been assembled in February after the Wexler Grove contract was signed, and before it collapsed on the initiative of 2 institutional investors who had approached Owen rather than the other way around. Ashford closed the folder and said the record did not show sabotage. It showed a man who had told them exactly what would happen in writing 9 months before it happened, and who had then been removed from the position that would have allowed him to prevent it. Celeste made one final attempt. She said the memo proved only that Owen was risk-averse and that any competent operator produces warnings. Ashford asked her to identify a single warning in the record that had turned out to be wrong. She did not answer, and the silence that followed lasted long enough that a board member near the end of the table began quietly to gather his papers. The vote was taken the next morning. 6 in favor of proceeding with the sale, 1 abstention, none against. Ashford was authorized to negotiate terms with the investor group led by Owen Parker, and to do it within 3 weeks, because after that, there would be nothing left worth buying. What made the negotiation difficult was not price. Owen had made his position clear in his own office on the 1st of April, and he did not soften it now. He told Ashford he was not interested in acquiring a division and inheriting its arrangement, and that he would proceed only if the transaction included a complete structural reconstitution. He put the conditions on a single page. The division would separate fully from Blackthorn Dynamics and operate as an independent company. Approval authority for pricing, staffing, and delivery commitments would reside inside the operating organization, with the review gate restored as a binding requirement no executive could waive, including him. No member of the Blackthorn family would hold an operating role or a board seat, and a meaningful ownership stake would be distributed to employees weighted toward tenure, so that the people who had stayed through the 6 months held something that could not be taken from them by an announcement in an atrium. Ashford asked whether the ownership provision was a condition or a preference. Owen said it was the only reason he was doing this at all, and that a company in which one person could reorganize 200 lives on the strength of a family relationship would fail again, eventually, regardless of who was running it. He said he had built a system once on the principle that authority and accountability travel together, had watched it dismantled in 90 seconds, and was not going to build a second one that could be dismantled the same way. The board accepted every condition. They had no leverage, and they knew it. And by then, several of them had begun to understand that they were not so much selling a division as being permitted to hand one over. Tristan Blackthorn was terminated on the 17th of April, before the transaction closed, and the notice referenced the Wexler Grove commitment and the overridden objection specifically. He had been in the building 1 year and 1 week. He requested a meeting with Ashford and was told there was nothing to discuss. On his way out, he asked the Human Resources Coordinator whether this would be characterized as a resignation, and was told it would be characterized accurately. Celeste Blackthorne was suspended by board resolution the same day, pending the conclusion of the governance review, and was not permitted to enter the building afterward without an escort. The framed cover came off the lobby wall within a month, and nobody could say who had removed it. The transaction closed on the 29th of April, 12 days before the runway would have expired. Owen came back onto the Northstar floor for the first time in 7 months on a Thursday morning through the same doors he had walked out of, and the first thing he noticed was the quiet. Not the productive quiet of the old floor, where somebody was always on a call. This was the quiet of 60 people who had spent 6 months learning that speaking was a risk. Maren Whitaker was still there. She had turned down 3 offers by then and had never told him about any of them. He found her at her desk with the Friday risk report she had been filling out privately since October, 30 weeks of it distributed to nobody. He asked her what she wanted, and she said she wanted to stop keeping a secret record of a company she worked for. He offered her the chief operating officer position that afternoon, with full authority over the delivery calendar and a permanent veto on any commercial commitment the capacity model could not support, and she accepted before he finished describing the compensation. The first thing they did together was hold a meeting in the same atrium. Owen did not use the lectern. He stood beside it, facing the room the way he had in September, and he spoke for about 4 minutes. He told them what had been bought and by whom. He explained the ownership structure and what it meant for people who had been there more than 3 years, which was most of the room. He told them the review gate was binding again, and that it now bound him as well, and that Maren held a veto he could not override. And he said the only thing he needed from them in the next 90 days was for people to start telling the truth in writing again, because a company that cannot describe its own condition cannot be repaired. Somebody in the middle rows asked what would happen to people who had gone along with things. Owen said nobody was being removed for having been afraid in an organization that had taught them to be afraid, and that what he cared about was what they did. Starting Monday, the clients came back more slowly than the story would suggest, and faster than the finances required. Douglas Hearn moved the remainder of Hearn Industrial's work over in June after visiting the floor personally and spending 2 hours with Maren rather than with Owen, which he later said was the part that convinced him. 2 of the 3 smaller departed accounts returned before the end of the summer. Wexler Grove did not return, and Owen did not pursue them, because the penalty settlement had already been absorbed by the parent company in the sale, and because he had told his own people they would not chase a client. They had failed until they could demonstrate they had fixed the thing that failed. Parker Ridge Advisory was folded into the new organization in July. The 16 people above the bank branch moved into the building in the operating framework Owen had written in a rented room in October. The 40 pages he had sent to nobody became the company's actual governance document. A year later, the company employed 240 people and had recorded 4 consecutive profitable quarters. 91 employees held equity, and for 28 of them, it had become the largest asset they owned. Voluntary turnover was under 6%. The Friday risk report was public, distributed to the entire staff, and appearing on it had stopped being a professional event. Owen never returned to Blackthorne Dynamics in any form. He was not an employee of that corporation, and never would be again. And the company he ran had no reporting line to anyone. He kept an office on the same floor as the delivery team still took the earliest meetings and refused the late ones, and there were people in the building who had worked there 8 months before, learning that he had once resigned in that atrium in front of 200 people. Blackthorne Dynamics survived without Northstar, smaller and considerably less profitable, under a chief executive appointed by the board in the autumn. Celeste's suspension became a separation in September, negotiated quietly on terms that were never disclosed. She did not appear at industry events afterward. Tristan took a position at a family friend's firm in another state and left it within a year. The last exchange between them happened by accident in a hotel lobby in late spring at a conference where Owen was speaking and Celeste was attending as someone else's guest. She stopped him near the elevators, and neither of them pretended not to have seen the other. She said she had thought about it constantly for a year and had arrived at something she wanted to say, which was that she had believed the division belonged to her, because the authority did. That she had run a company for 2 decades on the assumption that the chair produced the result, and everything else in the building was implementation. She said she had watched $200 million of client relationships leave in 6 months, and every one of them had left because of a person, not because of a structure. Owen listened the way he had listened to her in his office a year earlier, without interrupting and without visible reaction. Then he told her that Northstar had never been his either, that it had been 60 people on a delivery floor and a scheduler nobody had promoted, and a client who called at 7 in the morning, and that his entire contribution had been to build something that let those people do their work, and then to refuse to let anyone break it. He said that was the whole method, and that he had explained it to her in writing in July, and that she had thanked him for his thoroughness. He did not say it cruelly. He said it flat and specific, and without weight the way he said everything. And that was somehow worse. Then he told her he had a session starting, and he went to it, and Celeste Blackthorne stood by the elevators, understanding a year too late that the thing she had spent her life protecting had never been worth anything on its own. That a company is not the seat at the top of it, but the people capable of carrying it, and that she had given away the only one she had in order to make room for someone who could not.